adventurers, and welcome back. Tonight's discussion is going to be one in what I consider a series of foundational topics about historical reenactment or living history. And tonight's topic is developing a persona. Now, you might ask, what is a persona? Well, as the word suggests, person, it's a personage or portraying a character. Or what I like to think of is a framework within which you can develop an image or certain character that you're trying to portray. Now, some people don't like the thought of developing a persona. Well, folks, the fact is, anytime you put on your historical clothing and go out in the public, you're automatically portraying a persona, whether you like it or not. As the public perceives you, they're looking at a persona, an image that they think you are trying to portray. So it's very helpful to you if, to begin with, you decide what that persona is going to be, and that will help guide the rest of your research and development of your clothing, your accoutrements, your firearms, your camp gear, and everything associated with your living history presentation. The first thing I think you need to do when you're developing a persona is choose a time period, or maybe specifically to a certain year. Be that the Western fur trade of the United States, an earlier time period, War of 1812. You may go back to Lewis and Clark time period. A couple of years ago was the bicentennial of Lewis and Clark expedition. There was a lot of people doing living history surrounding the events of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Or you may go back even earlier in history. You want to do a Eastern Long Hunter persona, or a French and Indian War, a Revolutionary War, something like that. So it helps to define the time period, and even more so, a specific year. You'll find out later as you go on in your persona that knowing exact year can help you really sharply focus what you're trying to do. Next thing I think is a value to do is pick a geographic area that you're portraying. Personally, I portray a Western Rocky Mountain area based beaver trapper. So that helps me decide what was available to my character and what time period. Really sharply helps me focus that. Wouldn't be good for me to have weapons, for instance, that were beyond the time period that I was trying to portray, or decoration or some kind of clothing item that certainly was not available at the time period that I'm trying to portray. And if I hadn't chosen a persona, I might be tempted to collect a whole bunch of things like that that are completely out of character for that time period that I'm trying to portray. So a time period, or a time, a geographic location. Also, the next thing you want to think about is your own racial background and how that fits into your persona. The good thing about the Western fur trade in the mountain men era is it encompassed all, or most, all ethnic backgrounds that were in the United States at the time, be that Caucasian, Black American, Hispanic American, French Canadian, Native American certainly, many displaced Eastern tribes that came west, and even surprisingly Pacific Islanders. A good friend of mine recently wrote an article called Kanakas in the Fur Trade and brought to light many examples of Hawaiian Islanders who came up to the Rocky Mountain area and participated in the Western fur trade. So it's not hard to find a ethnic background to help to define your persona. Very easy to do so. Another thing you might consider is the economic background of your character. Was he an indentured servant? Where did he come from? What kind of job did he have before he came to the Rocky Mountains, for instance, on a fur trade caravan? Was he a saddle maker? Did he work as a blacksmith like James Beckworth or Jim Bridger? Kit Carson was an apprentice to a saddle maker. Was your character's background a farmer? Or did he work in the city in some craft? Or what was his economic background? A good place to start. And that, again, defines your time period and your research. So you can go back and begin to look at period documentation of items. What type of clothing was available at that time period? Let's say 1825. The styles between 1825 and 1835 changed a lot. So in 1825, as I was leaving St. Louis, my clothing would have a certain look to it. 10 years later, 15 years later in the mountains, my clothing would have changed because Number one, it would have wore out, and I would have begin to replace it with what was available, brain tan buckskin, or the things that were brought to rendezvous to replace and resupply the trapper. Those are the type of things I'd be wearing. So, very important to focus on a persona. You don't need to get caught up in that to make that, a huge pursuit. I find it very entertaining. I actually at one point sat down and rewrote a life story based on that persona, so I could bring a logical progression through where he went, what he participated in, what he would have known, and brought that up to a certain point and left it there. Someday I'd like to go back and add on, as I get older, the next 5 years to that story, other experiences that my character might have had. Okay, let's looking at my notes, see if I missed anything. Again, I don't know if I mentioned talking about being sure to pick a common background, a common character. It's very sketchy to go out and pick someone who is a well-known figure in American history, because most people know those folks, know their history, and would be able to find holes in your persona if you were, for instance, to decide that you wanted to portray General William Ashley. Well, we know a lot about General Ashley, and the general public might be in a presentation or seeing you out and where you declare that you were General Ashley, they'd begin to ask questions about, well, what about this? What about that? And it'd be nearly impossible for you to be able to do an accurate portrayal of William Ashley, unless you did it in a theatrical setting where you told the people up front, I'm going to be portraying General Ashley, and this is my interpretation of what I know of him, and then they would probably not ask you questions because they know you've stated up front you're just acting. We can't do that quite as easily when you're doing living history, because you don't get the opportunity to tell people the background. You're just out there doing the living history, and people come along and assume and start making assumptions based on what they see and what you say. So it's much more safer to pick a common character, and your accoutrements should be common also. If you are a common Rocky Mountain beaver trapper, it would be a little out of character to have an extremely expensive and fancy rifle with all kinds of ornate silver work on it and those sort of things. Yes, it would be possible to maybe explain that away if you were a well-known character such as Jim Bridger, who was once gifted a set of armor from William Drummond Stewart. Okay, well, I'm sure that was probably the only set of armor at the rendezvous. So if you feel bold and you want to go put some armor on and run around the rendezvous and portray Jim Bridger, more power to you. But that's going to be a difficult persona to pull off. It's not common. Again, people can find holes in it. So I'd suggest you don't do that. Kathy Johnson, look that name up on the internet. She wrote a book on developing a persona. I think it's Who Am I? Guide to Historical Personas or something like that. Again, name Kathy Johnson. If you did a search on her name and historical personas or developing a persona, you could find the book. I'll put an annotation on the screen for you, and also maybe a screenshot of one of her of that book. That's it for tonight. Thanks for dropping by again. Hope you're beginning to enjoy the videos. I've got a whole bunch more in mind. I want to take Teton Todd's Mountain Adventures a long ways. There's a lot of topics in mind. Hopefully we're going to get outside soon and do some how-tos and survival and enjoy the outdoors. Again, thank you for tuning in. Talk to you later.